Recently, my friends and I have been playing a game called Lethal Company. It's a very small indie title in early access right now, where you and your team of hapless corporate goons venture into spooky abandoned space installations to salvage valuable junk, whilst also trying not to get eaten by deadly alien monstrosities. It's a classic horror game setup, and don't get me wrong, getting stalked around dark corridors by an invisible killing machine as your flashlight starts to fail is definitely pretty terrifying. But what really surprised me about Lethal Company is that it is also one of the funniest games I have played in years.
Okay, let's go down.
There's a sentry gun down there.
It's dead.
Is it dead? No, it's fucking not! Oh, Jesus Christ. I've gotten swarmed by an army of killer space bees as we all struggle to extract their valuable honey. I've gotten accidentally battered to death by a desperate friend who'd lost radio contact and thought I was a monster. And I've gotten a front row seat to one of my pals having the bright idea of peeking outside the safety of our spaceship, only to realise that a gigantic alien beast was right outside the door, leaving me to scramble to trigger the escape sequence while listening to my screaming idiot friends get eaten. All of these moments and more have had me and my fellow suicidal space janitors in fits of laughter. But what really stood out to me about my time with Lethal Company is the fact that it isn't just a secret comedy game, it's also substantially funnier than a lot of games which try way harder to make you laugh. And it achieves this despite having almost nothing in it that you could describe as a joke. Think about it. At this stage, video games are capable of offering us all different kinds of experiences. There's games that make you think, games that get your heart racing, games that scare you, games that make you feel like a badass, the list is endless. But when it comes to comedy games, titles primarily designed to make us laugh, things are pretty hit and miss to say the least, and the most successful funny games are often the ones not obviously designed with that in mind. For every great comedic game like The Stanley Parable, Portal, or Monkey Island, there are 10 games which try to be funny but end up falling way short. To name just a few examples from the last couple of years, there's the new Saints Row game, which mostly revolves around making tired jokes about millennials being poor. There's Breath Edge, which bills itself as a sort of comedic irreverent Subnautica in space, by which I mean it makes multiple direct references to how it's an inferior clone of Subnautica disguised as jokes. And then of course there's Yik, the postmodern RPG, which made me want to lobotomize myself with a screwdriver. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that making a funny game is impossible, or that people have forgotten how to do it. In fact, this whole video is about why that's not the case, but it does seem like video games have a really hard time getting comedy right consistently. After all the examples of critically successful comedy games everyone's heard of I just used are more than a decade old. There are that few of them, and the reason why is kind of difficult to pin down. How is it that we can have a bunch of games made by so-called comedic professionals, using techniques that would work perfectly well in any other medium, that somehow contain nothing but jokes I found at best boring, or at worst, actively detrimental to the gameplay experience, but also have some of the funniest games I've ever played, like the madness that is Jazzpunk, the exquisite parody that is The Looker, and yes, the terrifying comedy chaos of Lethal Company, be games that don't have much in the way of traditional jokes at all. It's almost as if the source of all video gaming humor's problems and potential lies outside of the video game itself, independent of the actual jokes. This horrible, unpredictable, stupid, ugly, terrible taste in YouTube videos enigma that makes creating a comedy game very challenging indeed, but also allows for games that get things right to be among the most memorably and personally hilarious things out there. In case you haven't guessed, yes, I'm talking about you, the audience. See, the fact that you and I as players are not only responsible for the pace and progression of a game, but can also exercise a degree of control over the world itself, means that comedy techniques that work perfectly well in other mediums are often less effective when it comes to video games. The player's perspective and capacity to manipulate how a joke gets told, not to mention the fact that we can create humor for ourselves, drastically changes the rules of comedy, and means the people who want to make a funny game suddenly needs to consider a whole new dimension of joke structure. Basically, when the pacing and perspective would normally be in the hands of the comedian, when it comes to video games, it's instead in the hands of the player, meaning that the two need to work together in order for a joke to be effective. To my mind, there are three main problems that stand in the way of a video game fulfilling its comedic potential, and I've listed them as follows because apparently it's good for engagement metrics or something, no idea if that's true or not, oh well. They are involvement, dissonance, and control. And you might say that that is a fairly arbitrary choice of words, and it is, I don't care. See, it's the letters, it matches up. Oh, I really do care, see? Whatever, let's start with that first one, involvement. Because I think it's one of the more obvious ways that otherwise well-meaning video games can screw up their humour. And it arises when games fail to take into account the presence of the player, and the fact that watching jokes is way less fun than being involved in one. A good example of this is Forspoken, a game that was pretty universally panned for its irritating jokes that feel like they go on way too long. And that's fair. But what a lot of people missed is that this isn't because of the game's writing or voice acting, both of which are broadly okay.
Destruction and corruption are beautiful forms of creation in themselves.
I don't sound like that.
You absolutely sound like that.
I know you absolutely sound like that. Yeah, see? Two can play at that game.
The real reason why the game's jokes feel so irritating is that Forspoken is constantly taking away your control and stopping the flow of gameplay in order for Frey and Cuff to do a bit of banter. In most other mediums, this kind of joke where you passively watch it happen from the sidelines is how we expect things to work, but in video games, we're conditioned to want to be in some way involved with what's going on screen. So not only is Forspoken's dialogue not amazing, with the occasional real stinker line, you resent it for actively depriving you of a feeling of agency. Even in games with substantially better writing, like say Grand Theft Auto, there's still this weird whiplash you feel as a game that mostly prides itself on being a player-empowered sandbox suddenly slams down the fourth wall, straps you to your chair, and forces you into a passive role whenever a joke is happening. By keeping players at arm's length and forcing them to merely watch as comedy is done at them, rather than getting them to participate, games that lean on this passive style of humour do mitigate the risks of us missing or ruining a joke, but they also ignore the unique visceral connection to the story and world that video games offer, and they often end up just being a poor imitation of more traditional media. This is something that the South Park RPGs kind of fall into. They're mostly just feature-length episodes that get split up into a bunch of pieces and have stretches of middling and surprisingly joke-light RPG stuck in between. It's not that the games aren't broadly funny, it's just that they're the same kind of funny as the TV show, but with worse pacing, and a sense that the game and the cutscenes are stepping on each other's toes. And very rarely do you get the sense that it's making the most of the unique vectors for comedy that only video games offer. Compare them to, say, the Loathing RPGs or Jazzpunk, which rather than merely showing you jokes, allow you to make jokes happen for yourself as part of a call and response structure, positioning the player not as the passive audience, but as either the one telling the joke or as the comedic foil, adding a much greater feeling of investment and engagement to every laugh. Not all of the jokes land, but when they do, they hit that much harder because each of the puns you find in a Loathing game or the sections of absurdism you stumble upon in Jazzpunk only appear when you either prod something or someone that looks interesting, or you spot an opportunity for mischief and make the joke happen yourself. The key to a more active, interactive style of comedy is embracing the player's role as the engine of a game's perspective and pacing rather than trying to fight or restrict them. In this instance, humour kind of works the same way as difficulty in a video game. The act of having to work for something and to make choices and pay attention in order to make a joke happen creates this bond of investment between you and the eventual payoff that makes it feel way better, even if the joke isn't particularly clever. The magic X factor that makes games like, say, Portal so reliably funny is the fact that its jokes, while ostensibly aimed at a fellow fictional character, are actually all in response to the actions of the player. In the Portal games, GLaDOS' wit and Wheatley's idiocy are all the funnier because not only are you quickly conditioned into associating jokes with being a reward for beating a puzzle, but you're the one who has to react to them. Chell is blessedly completely silent and is barely even a character at all. This stuff is also true for multiplayer comedy games. Rather than simply make a joke for the players, like in Genital Jousting, Mount Your Friends, or even in Monster Prom, as much as I enjoy that game, or leaving players completely to their own devices, like in Comedy Night or the aptly named Be Funny Now, the best multiplayer comedy games forge a connection between the game and the players. The Jackbox Party Pack games are great here, prompting and gamifying the jokes just enough to incentivize and reward creativity without smothering the player-led comedy under its own attempts at humor. Equally, the likes of Party Animals and Gang Beasts set up a context and goals that players can subvert, as well as provide them with some comedy prompts, but ultimately leave the players to be the fundamental engine that drives the humor. Of course, that's not to say that passive, more traditional jokes have no place in games. Of course they do. The fact that they don't require the player's active involvement mean that they can be a great change of pace and a way to cool the player down between moments of high intensity. Hi-Fi Rush, a very funny game, is absolutely great here. The jokes very sensibly almost never intrude on the very hectic combat, but they are very welcome as a way to break up the action and give you a rest every now and again between sections of fighting. The level Breaking Out, for example, is one single long combat gauntlet followed by a tough boss fight against this goddess named Corsica. Without the gags before and after involving some pretty disastrous stealth and Corsica getting a series of increasingly contrived concussions, you'd be completely exhausted by the end. But instead, these funny cutscene interludes give your fingers a break and your brain a chance to reset before the next fight begins. It is very telling though that the one time Hi-Fi Rush breaks the gameplay humour split is for its best joke of giving you a dud upgrade that nerfs you to see if you're paying attention, which is the sort of shit that I absolutely love. This brings me neatly onto the second big problem with video gaming humour, and that's the idea that even when games do manage to successfully connect comedy and mechanics, there's often a level of dissonance between them as their purposes come into conflict. To show you what I mean, look at this quest in Borderlands 3. It's a satire of exploitative pay-to-win games and boring escort quests, which is a bit rich coming from Gearbox, but fine, whatever. The problem comes from the fact that in order to parody bad escort quests and glitchy early access games, it makes you do a bad, boring, really long escort quest and sticks this horrible glitch filter over everything the entire time, meaning that whatever little played-out humour this quest ends up offering just evaporates because you're far more concerned with the idea that this overlong joke is the thing that's stopping you from having fun. This problem in games happens over and over again, because so much comedy thrives on a reversal of expectations and a surprise twist where you weren't expecting one, that quite often a funny experience and a fun experience stand directly at odds. The Binding of Isaac is full of this stuff. A bunch of the game's quote-unquote upgrades actually just debuff you indirectly or make it easy to kill yourself. The ways they do this, like giving you silly rebound tiers or spawning a bunch of bombs, can be funny, but the 2-second breath escalation of mild amusement you get from these items is rarely worth the upwards of 20-minute runs they sometimes completely waste. Same with this bell in God of War Ragnarok. Ringing it over and over makes this squirrel version of ProZD say some funny lines.
Stop with the stupid chime!
But because you quickly become conditioned to keep doing it in the hopes you'll get a new response out of him, you'll only ever stop long after he's run out of jokes to tell and you've gotten bored, ruining some otherwise good material. In order to remedy this problem of mechanics and gameplay hurting one another, games need to be sure to never make jokes that undermine the core gameplay loop or would teach players to do things that aren't actually fun. The creator of amazing satire game The Looker, Bradley Lovell, speaks about this in a GDC talk. He deliberately chose to keep all the jokes in the game in some way related to the core loop of solving puzzles and opening up new areas. So while these bits where you have to solve a puzzle on a kiddie restaurant menu, where you get tricked into trying to solve a hard maze when you don't need to, or the game briefly turns into a shooter might be very silly, they never change your fundamental relationship with the game or with the mechanics. You're still learning and applying rules, and you're always drawing lines to connect things, meaning that the jokes always stay fun and don't undermine the rest of the experience, even though there's lots of space in the game for super hidden Easter eggs and format breaking stuff that the game leaves deliberately unexplored. Another great example is in the Stanley Parable's running broom closet gag. Basically, there's this broom closet you can go into that's not related to the main plot at all, leading to the narrator getting progressively more upset with you every time you walk in successive runs. It's a great joke and a great example of how defying instructions can lead to comedy.
Oh no, not again. I won't be part of this. I'm not going to...
However, once the joke is over and the narrator has run out of things to say, the game boards up the broom closet permanently, preventing you from ever going in again, which not only stops you from continuing to hang around in the hopes of seeing content that isn't there, it also serves as a great final punchline. This idea of establishing a kind of implicit limit to what lengths a game will and won't go to is particularly important for games using metafictional humour and games that make the player the butt of the joke, because by their nature, both of these kinds of comedy are going to be attacking your preconceptions, and so it's very easy for them to accidentally catch your enjoyment in the crossfire. Undertale, for example, almost never makes bullshit impossible to avoid attacks or puzzles with a contrived degree of difficulty, even though it's fertile ground for comedy. Instead, it makes jokes out of coincidences in your favour and comically weak enemy attacks, all in service of keeping the tone light and keeping its challenges feeling fair. This strategy also gives the game somewhere to go in genocide mode where the gloves really come off and the game stops messing around, featuring such bullshit as the game attacking you in menus. Equally, when it comes to games that put the player in the crosshairs, the successful ones are the ones that keep an eye on your level of enjoyment and what sort of humour you're expecting. Nier Automata's joke endings are super frustrating because not only is the idea of a non-combat game over never communicated, the game doesn't autosave, so you could potentially lose hours of gameplay for the sake of one cheap gag. Conversely, FromSoft's games actually do this stuff very well. Dying and respawning over and over is a core part of the game, and so every Souls title can occasionally feel free to indulge in a bullshit ambush or trap purely for the purposes of comedy. Because the player expects this kind of difficulty, and because you usually learn some sort of lesson in the process, we're able to forgive the game and laugh along with it, even if these little gargoyle fuckers do way too much damage. Equally, Disco Elysium, a game with more jokes in it than you'd expect, softens the blow of some of its more humiliating jokes at the player's expense by having them not be inevitable, but the result of your build choices combined with the capriciously random nature of dice rolls. It's way more fun to watch your character fail to punch a child, faceplant, and then start crying when you know that A, this isn't going to cost you in any real sense, and B, that it's ultimately an ironic and unexpected consequence of your choices up until that point, rather than something that was forced upon you. This is an excellent segue that's so good it may have been written in advance into the final problem that gaming humour often faces, and that is an inability or an unwillingness to give up control. Games are by nature flexible, and what that means is that comedy can often evolve emergently through play as systems interact, things go wrong, and even as players decide to use their mastery over the mechanics to flip the script and become comedians themselves. And games that try to suppress this nature of emergent, unwritten comedy end up not only leaving a bunch of laughs on the table, but they also disrupt the critical back and forth connection between player and developer that makes the best video game humour work. High on Life, I feel, really bungles this one. It's a comedy FPS where your gun can talk, where the whole world is full of weird, annoying characters, and yet, bafflingly, the game not only doesn't let you shoot random stuff in the environment to get funny reactions out of people and generally mess around, Kenny the alleged sex pest gun will outright scold you for even attempting to do that.
Stop it, we're not killing this one!
The idea of a comedy game that seems to be actively opposed to the idea of the player trying to make their own jokes, like you're not funny enough to riff with the pros, really soured my experience with the game that in places has some really good gags. By contrast, something like, say, Hitman, which is a game that on the face of it takes itself pretty seriously, is a goldmine for slapstick comedy because the game embraces players using its mechanics in unconventional ways to make stupid stuff happen. You can dress up as a flamingo and batter war criminals unconscious with a fish, you can shoot a lady so hard she falls into a grave, and you can even do classic banana peel shenanigans because of course you can. And the fact that the game never tells you that any of this stuff is possible and plays your antics totally straight makes you feel like even more of a comedy genius. Systemic, flexible mechanics are kind of by nature going to lead to unexpected, immersion-breaking, and thus humorous scenarios. So games with these mechanics work best by leaning into them and encouraging player-led comedy rather than trying to fight the inevitable. Everything from supplying the player with fun toys to use on enemies, to giving them access to otherwise useless but fun mechanics to use at inappropriate times, or just being generous with systems that allow for the creation of dumb stuff, can all empower comedy without taking away the initiative from players. This approach can even extend to things going wrong in games outside of the player's control. The likes of Surgeon Sim and Octodad derive humour from the juxtaposition of you trying to perform simple tasks and the fact that the physics system and controls are designed to make doing that as difficult and clumsy as humanly possible. And the crazy chain reaction physics systems in games like Noita and Worms are deliberately amplified to heighten the inherent comedy of everything going horribly wrong and spinning wildly out of control. The key though is that the players are the ones who get to set the comedy into action and experience their chaotic effects, rather than a third party. And to finally get around to the game I started the video with, I think Lethal Company is one of the best expressions of this kind of emergent comedy that I've seen in a very long time. Everything in the game is designed around the idea that A, things will go horribly wrong, and B, they will go wrong in a funny, chaotic way.
Okay, yeah, fine.
We might not want to get a hustle on though, because it's 5 o'clock. I'm coming back in the ship! I'm coming back to 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 the ship! Thanks to the use of proximity chat and the fact that dead people can't talk, you'll be constantly left in the dark in both a figurative and literal sense, prompting you to make decisions based on suicidal courage or panicked cowardice, both of which will take time and make noise, which will only draw more danger towards you. Equally, all the tools, from the fact that walkie-talkies are surprisingly inconvenient to use, to the jetpack being almost impossible to control, to the weapons tricking you into thinking you can fight things you definitely can't, introduce new problems to solve and new ways your plans can collapse just as much as they help you. Basically, the game is one big comedic farce in the same vein as Comedy of Errors or The Play That Goes Wrong. The humour is ultimately derived from the inherent conflict between how you wanted the mission to go, a nice, clean, profitable extraction, and how it ended up, which is more often than not a bloodbath at the hands of mystery monsters that ends in you battering your surviving co-worker to death to sell their corpse and make up your salvage quota. It's fantastic, and crucially, it all springs from the intersection of the player's subjectivity and the designer's comedic canvas, even if it doesn't have any traditional jokes. Really, that's what I think the biggest takeaway about comedy games is. While there are many conflicting theories about the psychological origin of humour, the unifying factor between all the best jokes is a sense of mutual understanding between the person telling it and the person experiencing it, a shared observation or subversion, or just a shared sense of whimsy. I think many games adhere too rigidly to the surface-level, artificial conventions of comedy instead of the more fundamental, organic core. Humor doesn't arise from denying players agency or by locking down possibilities, and it can appear in a surprising number of places, even where we didn't intend it to. Wherever a player and a designer can enter into a dialogue, comedy can take root, and the best games realize this fact and use it to their advantage. So really, I actually don't think that humor in video games is all that rare, it's more that we're not looking for it in the right places. Sure, full-fledged, purely comedy games are pretty few and far between, but that's because it's far easier, and often far funnier, to build jokes off a foundation of gameplay elements that a player already understands and cares about. And not only that, sometimes jokes can happen purely by accident. Skyrim's writing is on the whole as bland and unfunny as plain porridge, but damn if I don't laugh every single time I get hit by a giant and fly into space because of that bug Bethesda still haven't fixed, mostly because they're lazy, but also because it's really funny. The moral of the story is that just like how games are funnier when we're an active component of the joke and put effort into creating a punchline, so too do we need to seek out comedy in places beyond the surface level, whether that's in the grim nightmarescape of Dark Souls, the deceptively silly world of puzzles, or even games that try and trick you into thinking they're horror games when they're really not that scary at all. Oh god, what the fuck is that? Jesus Christ, run, what is the hell? Get out of there, run, no, ah! Hi and welcome to this, the After the Video segment. Did you laugh at all those funny jokes? Well, if you did, then you were wrong to do so. That was dry academic analysis and should be treated as such. On the other hand, thank you to everyone who said that I'm not funny and the jokes were terrible. You have correctly interpreted the video and I thank you for your continued support. Anyway, this is the part of every video where I talk to you about some people and things that need a little bit of praise thrown in their direction, while I show you some random footage that may or may not reappear in a later video, who knows. The thing I'd like to shout out this time is a plucky little team called Second Wind, a group of journalists and video people who broke off of The Escapist after a bunch of them got fired for dumb corporate reasons and have decided to go it alone. Now, normally I wouldn't shout out a thing this big, but I think the continued existence of independent games criticism and journalism on the internet is incredibly important, and with an ever-increasing number of gaming news outlets being shuttered or smothered by ads, supporting actual, real games writing and content creation is more important now than ever. So please do check them out and maybe throw some cash their way to ensure that they don't go bankrupt in their first year. The entire Second Wind team makes great stuff, please do check it out, it's not just Yahtzee, I swear. Speaking of independent games writers though, there's also someone else who could do with your cash, and that is, me. I love doing this work and hopefully you at least slightly enjoy watching, and that's why I feel the need to give a big sentimental shout out to all my Patreon supporters on every single video, because without them, this channel would not exist. As thanks for supporting the channel, patrons get early access to videos, updates full of my uncensored thoughts on every single episode, extra secret nuggets of game design goodness, and even shout outs at the very end for those kind enough to subscribe at the very top tiers. If you'd like to join them, then just click on the link in the description and then you can join my mysterious benefactors, who are Ali Wright, Andrew Lebrano, Asaran, Auna94, Brennan Spalding, Brian Atariani, Buy More Skyrim for Todd, Constantine Amend, Cool Jam, Cosmix360, Daniel Medjez, Das Kangaroo, David Setzer, Dirk Jan Karrenbeld, Digletier, Ekton, Edward Franklin Woods, Eugene Bulkin, Gazkul, IFR93, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Jordan Gear, Kevin Helpus, Luke Kokoran, Macewinder54, Marika Vladilina Altair, Mark Vallant, Nate Graff, NWDD, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasic, Reddedex, Regal Regex, Revelation, Ray's Dad, Silver Fulfi, Steam Rollerman, Steve Riley, Tom Marsden, Ty Guerin, Tyler Duncan, Uprising, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brandmeier, and ciao. Okay, that's all. I will see you around for hopefully a video before Christmas. Fingers crossed. Bye!